Margaret Lawson had always believed that family was the one place where dignity should never be questioned. At 70 years old, she had spent most of her life protecting that belief. She raised two children, supported her husband while he built a construction company from nothing, and quietly held the household together during the difficult years when success was still uncertain. After her husband Daniel passed away 4 years earlier, Margaret remained in the large brick house they had bought together decades before. The house stood on a quiet street in Asheville, North Carolina, surrounded by tall oak trees and the carefully maintained garden Daniel used to admire every morning with his coffee. On a mild Saturday evening in early autumn, Margaret adjusted the pearl necklace around her neck and looked at herself in the mirror. Her gray hair was styled neatly, her navy blue dress simple but elegant. The occasion was her granddaughter Olivia's engagement celebration at the Riverside Hotel ballroom. Margaret had helped pay for the event, though no one had formally asked her to. Her son Peter had simply mentioned how expensive venues had become these days, and Margaret understood the implication without further explanation. She had written a check large enough to ensure that everything would be perfect. As she drove to the hotel, she remembered Daniel's voice from years earlier. He had often warned her gently about Peter's growing appetite for expensive things. "Success changes people," Daniel used to say. "Sometimes it teaches them gratitude. Sometimes it teaches them entitlement." Margaret had never liked that word. Entitlement sounded harsh, and she preferred to believe the best about her own family. The Riverside ballroom glittered with golden lights and polished marble floors. Guests mingled near tall windows overlooking the river, servers moved gracefully between groups with trays of champagne, and soft piano music drifted through the air. A welcome table near the entrance displayed name cards for guests. A young event coordinator smiled brightly as Margaret approached. "Good evening, ma'am. May I have your name?" "Margaret Lawson." The woman quickly scanned the list and handed her a name badge attached to a ribbon. Margaret thanked her and stepped aside to pin the badge to her dress. When she glanced down, however, her hand froze halfway to her chest. The card did not say Margaret Lawson. Instead, in elegant gold lettering, it read, "The family sponsor." For a moment she thought she had misunderstood the phrase. But the tone of the words, decorative and obvious, made the meaning unmistakable. A group of guests nearby laughed softly as they noticed the badge. Margaret felt the warmth leave her face. She slowly attached the ribbon to her dress anyway. Inside the ballroom, Peter stood near the center speaking animatedly with several business acquaintances. His expensive charcoal suit fit him perfectly, and his confidence filled the room as easily as the music. Beside him stood his wife Linda, smiling politely while adjusting the sleeve of her designer jacket. When Peter saw his mother approaching, he lifted his glass and waved.
"Mom."
"Over here." Margaret walked toward them with steady steps. Peter embraced her quickly. "Glad you made it. Beautiful party, right?" "It certainly is," Margaret replied quietly. Linda leaned in for a brief air kiss. "You look lovely tonight, Margaret." As the conversation continued, Peter suddenly noticed the ribbon hanging from his mother's dress. His lips curved into a grin. "Oh, good, you're wearing it," he said. Margaret blinked. "You knew about this?" "Of course," Peter laughed. "Just a little joke. Everyone knows you helped make tonight happen." One of Peter's friends chuckled. "Best sponsor family could ask for." Margaret forced a polite smile, though the laughter felt sharp in her ears. Across the room, Olivia noticed her grandmother and hurried over. At 25, she looked radiant, her long dark hair curled loosely over her shoulders. She hugged Margaret warmly. "Grandma, thank you for coming." "I wouldn't miss it," Margaret said. Olivia stepped back and glanced at the badge. Her smile faltered slightly. "Dad thought it would be funny," she said quickly, lowering her voice. "I told him maybe it was a little obvious." "It's all right," Margaret replied gently. "Tonight is about you." But as the evening continued, the phrase on her badge followed her everywhere. Guests joked about it openly. Some called her the sponsor. Others joked that every family should have one. At one point, Linda raised her glass during a toast. "We also want to thank Margaret," she announced brightly. "Without her generosity, tonight wouldn't be nearly this beautiful." Applause echoed through the room. Margaret smiled politely while clapping with everyone else, but something inside her shifted quietly. Later that evening, she stepped outside onto the balcony overlooking the dark river. The cool air felt refreshing after the crowded ballroom. "Mrs. Lawson?" Margaret turned. A tall man in his late 50s approached carefully. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to serious conversations. "Arthur Bennett," he said, offering his hand. "I handled Daniel Lawson's estate." Margaret recognized him immediately. Daniel had trusted Arthur with many of his legal matters. "Of course," she said. "It's been a while." Arthur glanced toward the ballroom, and then at the ribbon on her dress. "I noticed the name tag," he said quietly. Margaret gave a tired smile. Family humor, apparently. Arthur's expression remained serious. Daniel anticipated something like this. Margaret frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Arthur hesitated before speaking. A few weeks before his death, Daniel updated his will with an additional clause. He insisted I keep it confidential unless circumstances suggested it might become relevant. Margaret's curiosity sharpened. "What kind of clause?" Arthur opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. "Daniel loved his family," Arthur said slowly. "But he worried about how you might be treated once he was gone." Margaret accepted the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside is a legal provision stating that any family member who publicly disrespects or exploits you forfeits their inheritance from Daniel's estate. Margaret stared at him. "You're serious?" Arthur nodded. "Completely." The sounds of laughter drifted through the open balcony doors. Margaret looked down at the ribbon again. The words "family sponsor" glowed under the ballroom lights. For the first time that evening, the embarrassment faded and was replaced by something else entirely. Understanding. Arthur spoke gently. "You don't have to do anything right now. Daniel hoped you'd never need that clause." Margaret folded the envelope slowly. "I think," she said after a moment, "I'd like to see what my family really believes first." Arthur studied her for a second before nodding. That sounds exactly like something Daniel would respect. Inside the ballroom, Peter's voice rose above the music as he joked loudly with his friends. Margaret watched through the glass doors. For years she had ignored small signs, little jokes, casual assumptions about her money, conversations that ended with her quietly writing another check. Tonight, for the first time, she saw them clearly, and she realized something important. This celebration might have been Olivia's engagement party, but it was also the moment Margaret Lawson stopped being the family sponsor and started paying attention. The morning after the engagement celebration, Margaret Lawson woke earlier than usual. Sunlight slipped through the tall curtains of her bedroom, casting long golden lines across the polished wooden floor. For a few seconds, she simply lay still, listening to the quiet of the house. The silence had once felt heavy after Daniel's death, like an empty room that echoed with memories. But this morning it felt different, clearer. On the nightstand beside her lay the envelope Arthur Bennett had given her. Margaret reached for it slowly. The paper was thick, the handwriting on the front unmistakably Daniel's. Seeing his familiar script made her chest tighten with emotion. For decades, that handwriting had appeared on birthday cards, grocery lists, and notes he sometimes left beside her coffee cup before leaving for work. She opened the envelope carefully and reread the document. The legal language was formal and precise, but its intention was simple. Daniel had written that any descendant who publicly humiliated, manipulated, or attempted to financially exploit Margaret would immediately lose their inheritance from his estate. Their portion would then be redistributed among family members who demonstrated respect and support toward her. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. Daniel had always been observant, even when he appeared quiet during family gatherings. Perhaps he had seen signs long before she had allowed herself to notice them. She folded the document again and placed it back into the envelope. "Why didn't you tell me?" she murmured softly to the empty room. But deep down, she already understood the answer. Daniel had wanted their children to love and respect their mother because they meant it, not because they feared losing money. Margaret rose from the bed and walked downstairs to the kitchen. The house still smelled faintly of the lemon polish she had used the day before the party. Outside, the garden sparkled with dew, and a pair of sparrows hopped between the rose bushes Daniel had planted many years ago. She prepared her tea slowly and sat at the kitchen table. The name badge from the party rested beside her cup. The family sponsor. She stared at it for a long time. Memories began to surface. Small moments that had seemed harmless at the time, but now felt different when placed side by side. The first one appeared just 6 months after Daniel's funeral. Peter had invited her to dinner at his house. The evening had begun pleasantly enough. Linda had cooked an elaborate meal, and Olivia had talked excitedly about finishing college. But once dessert arrived, Peter leaned back in his chair and casually mentioned that their house needed major renovations. Nothing extravagant, he had said. Just updating the kitchen and maybe expanding the living room. Margaret had nodded politely. Then Linda added gently, "Construction costs have skyrocketed lately." Peter had smiled at his mother. "You know Dad left you very comfortable, Mom." Margaret remembered the pause that followed. At the time, she had simply written a check for $25,000 the following week. She had told herself she was helping family. Now she stood up from the kitchen table and walked toward the hallway closet. Inside were several storage boxes containing financial documents. Margaret carried one box back to the table and opened it. Bank statements, receipts, and copies of checks filled the folders. One by one, she began reviewing them. Renovation assistance. Olivia's first car. Peter's business investment that had mysteriously disappeared within a year. A vacation in Hawaii where Margaret had been invited along, but ended up covering the entire cost for everyone. By mid-morning, the total number written on Margaret's notepad made her eyebrows rise. Over the past 4 years, she had given Peter and Linda more than $200,000. The phone rang. Margaret glanced at the screen. Linda. She hesitated before answering. "Good morning, Margaret." Linda's cheerful voice flowed through the speaker. "We were just talking about you." "That sounds concerning," Margaret replied lightly. Linda laughed. "Oh, don't be silly. We just wanted to thank you again for everything you did for Olivia's party last night. Everyone thought it was spectacular." "I'm glad Olivia enjoyed it." There was a short pause. "Well, actually," Linda continued, "that's part of why I'm calling. Olivia and Ethan are starting to plan their honeymoon." Margaret remained silent. "They've always dreamed of visiting Santorini," Linda said smoothly. "But with Ethan's new job and the wedding expenses, things are a little tight." Margaret recognized the familiar tone immediately. "And you were wondering if I might help," she finished calmly. Linda laughed softly again. "Oh, Margaret, you always understand things so quickly." Margaret stirred her tea slowly. "I'll think about it." The silence on the other end was immediate. "Well, they'll need to book soon," Linda said carefully. "I understand." Margaret ended the call politely. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Margaret walked to the front entrance and opened the door. Standing on the porch was her grandson, Daniel's namesake. Ethan Lawson was 22, tall and slightly awkward, with the same thoughtful eyes his grandfather had possessed.
Ethan.
Margaret smiled warmly.
"Ethan, come in."
He stepped inside, glancing around the hallway as if unsure where to stand. "I texted you last night," he said. "I wanted to check if you were okay." Margaret tilted her head. "Why wouldn't I be?" Ethan hesitated. "The name tag," he said quietly. "A lot of people notice." Margaret felt a surprising wave of gratitude. "You noticed too?" "Of course." He looked uncomfortable. "I thought it was pretty disrespectful." Margaret placed a hand gently on his arm. "That's kind of you to say." They moved to the kitchen and sat down with fresh tea. For several minutes they spoke about simple things, Ethan's university classes, his interest in opening a small coffee shop someday, and the rising cost of starting a business. Then Ethan spoke again, more hesitantly. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did my parents ask you about your house recently?" Margaret frowned slightly.
No.
"Why?" Ethan looked down at his cup. "I overheard them talking last week," he admitted. "Dad said the house is probably worth a fortune now, and that it doesn't make sense for one person to live here alone." Margaret felt a cold sensation settle in her stomach. "What exactly did he say?" "He mentioned maybe convincing you to move into one of those retirement communities outside the city," Ethan said carefully. "Then they could sell the house while the market is hot." The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet. Margaret slowly leaned back in her chair. Her home was filled with memories, birthdays, holidays, long evenings with Daniel in the garden. The idea of someone else deciding its fate felt deeply unsettling. Ethan looked worried.
I'm sorry.
"I probably shouldn't have said anything." "No," Margaret said softly. "I'm glad you did." She studied her grandson carefully. Unlike Peter, Ethan had never asked her for money. In fact, he often seemed uncomfortable whenever financial topics appeared during family conversations. Margaret suddenly realized something important. Not everyone in the family saw her the same way. Just as she opened her mouth to speak again, the sound of a car door slamming echoed outside. Through the kitchen window, she saw Peter's car pulling into the driveway. Ethan sighed quietly. "Here we go." A moment later, the front door opened without knocking. "Mom," Peter called loudly. Margaret stood slowly. "I suppose the conversation is about to become more interesting," she said. Peter appeared in the kitchen doorway seconds later, his expression tense. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened at the party." He stopped abruptly when he noticed Ethan sitting at the table. "What are you doing here?" "Having tea with Grandma," Ethan replied calmly. Peter looked irritated. "This is family business." Ethan met his father's gaze. "I am family." Margaret watched them both carefully. Something inside her had changed since the night before. The uncertainty she once felt around Peter's demands was gone. Now she simply wanted the truth. And she had a feeling she was about to hear plenty of it. Peter Lawson stepped fully into the kitchen, his expression tight with barely contained frustration. He loosened the knot of his tie as if the air in the room had suddenly become too thick to breathe. Margaret watched him carefully while Ethan remained seated at the table, his posture calm but alert. "I think we should speak privately," Peter said, glancing pointedly at his son. Margaret folded her hands calmly on the table. "Anything you have to say can be said here." Peter hesitated. For years he had relied on speaking with his mother alone, where his tone could soften and his arguments could take on the familiar rhythm that always ended with her agreeing to help him financially. But with Ethan present, the dynamic felt different. Peter exhaled slowly and pulled out a chair. "Fine," he said, sitting down. For a moment no one spoke. Margaret waited patiently. Finally Peter leaned forward. "Mom, what happened last night was embarrassing." Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. "Embarrassing?" "Yes," he replied quickly. "You looked upset the whole evening. Guests noticed. Perhaps the name badge contributed to that." Peter sighed. "It was just a joke. A joke about your mother being a financial sponsor." "You're taking it too seriously," he insisted. Ethan spoke quietly from across the table. "It didn't seem like a joke to most people." Peter turned sharply toward him. "I didn't ask for your opinion." Margaret lifted a hand gently. "Peter, let's keep this civil." He rubbed his forehead. "Look, Mom, I'm trying to explain something important. People were confused last night. You've always been generous with the family. That's something we're proud of. But lately you've been acting distant." "Distant," Margaret repeated calmly. "You didn't say anything when Linda thanked you publicly. And Olivia told me you seemed uncomfortable when people congratulated you for funding the event." Margaret looked at him steadily. "I didn't realize generosity required a public announcement." Peter shifted in his seat. "That's not what I meant." The tension in the room thickened. Margaret could see the familiar strategy beginning to form in her son's mind, the careful balance of guilt and persuasion he had used for years. Mom, Peter continued, softening his voice. We're family. We support each other. When Dad was alive, he always helped everyone. You know that. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, he did. And now that responsibility kind of falls to you, Peter added. Ethan frowned. Responsibility? He asked quietly. Peter ignored him. The truth is, Peter continued, we're just trying to make smart decisions for the future. You've got more resources than you could ever spend in your lifetime. Margaret said nothing. So when we talk about investments or property decisions, Peter said, it's really about protecting the family legacy. Margaret's expression remained calm, but inside her thoughts sharpened. Is that why you've been discussing selling my house? Peter froze. For a brief moment his confidence disappeared. Who told you that? He asked sharply. Ethan met his father's gaze, without hesitation. I did. Peter's face darkened. You were listening to private conversations? You were speaking loudly enough for anyone in the hallway to hear, Ethan replied. Margaret spoke before the tension escalated further. Peter, is it true? He leaned back in his chair. We were just discussing possibilities. Possibilities that involve moving me out of my home? Mom, don't make it sound dramatic, he said quickly. Sunrise Haven is a beautiful retirement community. Plenty of people your age live there. I'm 70, Margaret said calmly. Not 90. Peter spread his hands. That's not the point. The house is huge. It doesn't make sense financially. To whom? To all of us. Margaret leaned slightly forward. Explain that. Peter hesitated again. If you sold the property, he said carefully, the money could be invested more efficiently. It could support the whole family long term. Ethan shook his head slowly. You mean it could support you? Peter slammed his hand lightly against the table. Enough. Margaret's voice remained calm. Peter, shouting won't help your argument. He looked at her, frustration written across his face. I'm trying to help you, Mom, by deciding where I should live. By making sure your assets are managed responsibly. Margaret studied him for several seconds. Do you believe I'm incapable of managing them myself? Peter hesitated. Well, you've never really handled finances on your own. The statement hung heavily in the air. Margaret suddenly understood something important. Peter truly believed what he was saying. For years Daniel had managed their investments, and Margaret had trusted him completely. Peter had quietly convinced himself that this meant she lacked financial understanding. Ethan leaned forward. Grandma doesn't need anyone managing her life. Peter turned to him sharply again. You don't understand how complicated these things are. Then explain them, Ethan said calmly. Peter stood up suddenly and began pacing across the kitchen. This is exactly the problem, he said. Everyone thinks they know better. But I'm the one trying to keep the family stable. Margaret watched him carefully. For the first time in years, she felt no pressure to calm him or reassure him. Instead, she simply observed. What exactly do you want from me today, Peter? She asked. He stopped pacing. We need to have a serious discussion about financial planning, he said. Linda, and I think it would be wise to arrange a power of attorney. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan sat upright instantly. A power of attorney? Peter nodded. It's a normal legal step. Someone responsible manages financial decisions on behalf of an older family member. Margaret's voice remained steady. And that responsible person would be you. Of course, Peter replied. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. You think Grandma can't make her own decisions? Peter rubbed his temples again. It's not about ability. It's about efficiency. Margaret felt a quiet sense of clarity settling inside her mind. So, you believe the best solution is for you to control my finances? Peter nodded slowly. Yes. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Interesting. Peter mistook her calmness for agreement. I'm glad you understand, he said. Margaret smiled slightly. Oh, I understand perfectly. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon sun had begun to sink lower behind the oak trees. Shadows stretched across the garden Daniel had once cared for so carefully. Margaret looked at Ethan briefly. His expression was tense, but supportive. Then she turned back to her son. Peter, she said gently, I'd like you to attend dinner here this Saturday. He frowned. Dinner? Yes, Margaret continued. Bring Linda. Olivia and Ethan can come as well. What's the occasion? Peter asked suspiciously. Margaret's smile remained calm. Let's call it a family conversation. Peter studied her face, trying to read her intentions. All right, he said slowly, but we should also invite Arthur Bennett. If we're discussing legal arrangements, it makes sense for the estate attorney to be present. Margaret nodded. That's an excellent idea. Peter seemed satisfied with this answer. Good, he said. Then we can finally sort everything out properly. He grabbed his jacket from the chair and headed toward the hallway. At the door he paused.
I'm glad we talked, Mom.
I know this conversation might have seemed difficult, but I'm only looking out for you. Margaret gave a polite nod. I'm sure you believe that.
Peter left.
The front door closed firmly behind him. Silence filled the kitchen again. Ethan looked at his grandmother carefully. You handled that really well. Margaret exhaled slowly. I've had a lot of time to think lately. He studied her expression. You already know what you're going to do, don't you? Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the garden. Yes, she said quietly. The dinner on Saturday would not just be another family gathering. It would be the moment when the truth finally came into the open. And for the first time since Daniel's death, Margaret felt completely ready for it. Saturday evening arrived with cool autumn air and the scent of fallen leaves drifting through Margaret Lawson's garden. The house looked warm and welcoming under the soft glow of porch lights. Inside, the dining table had been set carefully with white plates, polished silverware, and a bouquet of fresh lilies in the center. Margaret had always believed that even serious conversations should happen in a space that felt respectful and calm. In the kitchen, a pot of soup simmered quietly on the stove while roasted vegetables warmed in the oven. Margaret moved slowly between the counter and the table, adjusting small details the way she always had when preparing for family dinners. Yet tonight felt different. There was no nervousness in her movements, no quiet anxiety about keeping the peace. Instead, she felt steady. Ethan arrived first, just as the sky began to darken. He stepped inside carrying a small bakery box. I brought dessert, he said with a slight smile. Chocolate cake from Maple Street Bakery. Margaret smiled warmly. That's thoughtful. He set the box on the counter and looked around the dining room. You've really prepared for this. Margaret nodded. It's important that conversations like tonight happen properly. Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter. Do you want me to stay close in case things get tense? Margaret chuckled softly. I suspect they might. A few minutes later the doorbell rang again. Peter and Linda stood on the porch. Peter wore another expensive suit despite the casual nature of the evening, while Linda carried a bottle of wine and a carefully practiced smile. Evening, Margaret, she said.
Come in.
They stepped inside. Linda immediately began looking around the living room, noticing small changes she hadn't seen before. Margaret had recently rearranged some furniture and hung 2 paintings she had created during her art classes. You redecorated, Linda observed. Just a few updates, Margaret replied. Peter barely noticed the decorations. His eyes moved through the house with quiet calculation, as if assessing the property's value with every glance. Olivia arrived shortly afterward with her fiancé, Ethan Carter. She hugged her grandmother warmly, clearly relieved to see a peaceful atmosphere so far. Finally, the last guest arrived. Arthur Bennett stepped through the door carrying his leather briefcase. His calm presence seemed to change the tone of the evening immediately. Good evening, Margaret, he said politely. Thank you for coming. The group moved into the dining room where dinner began, with polite conversation. For a while the atmosphere remained surprisingly pleasant. Olivia spoke about her wedding plans, Ethan Carter discussed his new job at an architecture firm, and Linda complimented the food several times. But beneath the surface, tension waited patiently. It appeared when Peter cleared his throat midway through the meal. "Mom," he said, placing his napkin beside his plate, "I think this is a good time to talk about the situation we discussed earlier this week." Margaret looked up calmly. "Go ahead." Peter glanced briefly at Arthur before continuing. "As I explained before, Linda and I have concerns about some of your recent decisions." Olivia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "What decisions?" she asked. Peter continued speaking as if presenting a business proposal. "Mom has been making significant financial commitments without consulting anyone in the family. Investments, donations, and other things that may not be wise long-term." Ethan frowned slightly. "Grandma can decide how she spends her own money." Peter held up a hand. "That's exactly the problem. She's acting impulsively." Margaret set down her fork. "Impulsively?" "Yes," Peter said firmly. "You're supporting Ethan's coffee shop idea, for example." Ethan looked surprised. "How do you know about that?" Peter glanced at him coldly. "You mentioned it the other day." Margaret spoke quietly. "I invested a small amount to help Ethan begin planning. It's hardly reckless." Peter leaned forward. "It's not about the amount. It's about the pattern." Linda joined the conversation. "We're worried about you, Margaret," she said gently. "You've been isolating yourself, making financial decisions alone, and refusing family advice." Arthur remained silent, observing carefully. Peter took a deep breath. "That's why Linda and I believe it's time to establish a power of attorney arrangement." The room fell silent instantly. Olivia looked confused. "A power of attorney? For Grandma?" Peter nodded. "It would simply allow someone responsible to oversee financial decisions." Margaret asked calmly, "And that responsible person would be you?"
Peter didn't hesitate.
"Yes." Ethan shook his head slowly. "That's unbelievable." Peter ignored him and turned toward Arthur. "You're familiar with these arrangements. It's a reasonable step." Arthur leaned back slightly. "It can be appropriate in situations involving diminished capacity." Peter nodded quickly. "Exactly." Arthur looked toward Margaret. "Do you believe Mrs. Lawson is incapable of managing her affairs?" Peter hesitated for half a second. "She's making poor decisions." "That wasn't my question," Arthur said calmly. Peter's patience began to crack. "She's funding unrealistic business ideas and refusing to consider selling this house, even though the market is perfect right now." Margaret stood slowly. The movement drew everyone's attention. "I think it's time we address the real issue," she said quietly. Peter crossed his arms. "Finally." Margaret looked toward Arthur. "Would you mind explaining the document my husband added to his will?" Arthur opened his briefcase slowly and removed a sealed envelope. Peter frowned. "What document?" Arthur spoke calmly. "Shortly before his death, Daniel Lawson added a legal clause to his will." Linda's smile faded slightly. "What kind of clause?" Arthur continued. "It states that any descendant who publicly humiliates, manipulates, or attempts to exploit Margaret Lawson forfeits their inheritance from Daniel's estate." The room went completely still. Peter blinked.
"What?"
Arthur placed the document on the table. The clause was designed specifically to protect Margaret from financial pressure or disrespect. Linda's voice trembled slightly. "That's absurd." Arthur shook his head. "It is legally binding." Peter laughed nervously. "Dad would never write something like that." "He did," Arthur replied calmly. "And unfortunately," he added, "there have been several documented incidents that may qualify." Peter's face flushed. "What incidents?" Arthur glanced briefly at Margaret before speaking. "The name badge at Olivia's engagement party, publicly presenting Margaret as the financial sponsor." Olivia looked down at the table. Arthur continued. "The repeated financial requests over the past several years. The public announcement about funding a honeymoon without prior agreement. And tonight's attempt to establish financial control over her assets." Peter stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous." Arthur remained calm. Margaret now has the legal right to enforce the clause. Peter turned toward his mother. You wouldn't actually do that. Margaret looked at him steadily. For years I helped this family because I believed generosity would bring us closer together. Peter shook his head. You're overreacting. Am I? Margaret's voice remained quiet but firm. When was the last time you visited without asking for money? Peter said nothing. Linda stepped forward quickly. Margaret, surely we can discuss this privately. Margaret shook her head gently.
No.
She looked around the table. Respect should not require secrecy. Arthur folded his hands. Margaret, the decision is yours. Peter stared at her. You're not serious. Margaret met his gaze calmly. Yes, she said. I am. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said all evening, because everyone in the room suddenly realized something. Margaret Lawson was no longer the quiet, generous woman they had taken for granted. And the balance of power in the family had just changed completely. For several seconds after Margaret Lawson spoke, no one in the dining room moved. Peter remained standing beside his chair, his face pale with disbelief. Linda looked as though the ground beneath her had suddenly shifted. Olivia sat frozen, her eyes moving between her father, her grandmother, and the document lying quietly on the table. Arthur Bennett calmly folded his hands as if he had simply finished explaining a routine legal matter. But everyone in the room understood that nothing about the moment was routine. You can't be serious, Peter finally said, his voice sharp and strained. Margaret did not raise her voice. I've never been more serious. Peter let out a short laugh that sounded forced. You're going to destroy your own family because of a joke at a party? Margaret looked at him steadily. This didn't begin with the party. Ethan shifted in his chair but remained silent. Linda stepped forward quickly, her tone suddenly softer. Margaret, perhaps we should talk privately. I think emotions are running high tonight. Margaret shook her head gently.
No, Linda.
For years these conversations happened privately. That's why nothing ever changed. Peter slammed his hand lightly on the table. So, this is a public humiliation instead? Arthur spoke calmly before the argument could escalate. No one is humiliating you, Peter. The legal clause simply responds to actions that have already occurred. Peter turned toward him angrily. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Arthur remained perfectly composed. I'm doing my job. Margaret looked around the table slowly, her gaze resting briefly on each person present. When Daniel and I built our life together, she said quietly, we believed that family meant support, respect, and trust. Money was never supposed to replace those things. Peter crossed his arms. We respect you. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Do you? He hesitated. For 4 years after your father died, I helped whenever you asked, she continued. Home renovations, investments, vacations, cars, weddings. I never once refused. Linda looked uncomfortable. That was generosity, Margaret. And we appreciated it. Margaret nodded. I believe that too. But generosity should come from love, not expectation. Olivia finally spoke, her voice uncertain. Grandma, are we really losing our inheritance? Arthur answered calmly. The clause specifically applies to individuals who participated in the disrespectful behavior. Peter turned toward him again. So, what? My entire share disappears? Arthur nodded slightly. Yes. Peter stared at his mother. You're punishing me. No, Margaret said quietly. I'm protecting myself. Linda's voice suddenly became desperate. Margaret, think about the future. Families argue sometimes. That doesn't mean we should destroy everything. Margaret looked at her calmly. This family wasn't destroyed tonight. She paused. It began falling apart the moment respect disappeared. Peter shook his head in disbelief. You've changed. Margaret smiled faintly.
No, Peter.
I finally stopped ignoring what was already happening. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Olivia slowly stood up. Her eyes were filled with tears. I should have said something at the party, she admitted quietly. When I saw the name tag, I knew it was wrong. Margaret's expression softened. You're not responsible for your parents' choices. But I stayed quiet, Olivia said. Margaret reached out and gently squeezed her hand. Sometimes learning to speak up takes time. Peter looked at Olivia in frustration. You're taking her side now? Olivia looked at him calmly. I'm taking the side that makes sense. Peter stared at the table, breathing heavily. Finally, he pushed his chair back. This is unbelievable, he muttered. Linda grabbed her purse quickly. We should go. Peter turned toward the door, but before leaving he looked back at his mother one last time. You'll regret this, he said. Margaret did not respond. Peter and Linda left the house without another word. The front door closed heavily behind them. Silence settled across the dining room. Olivia wiped her eyes. I'm sorry things turned out like this. Margaret gently shook her head. Sometimes difficult truths are necessary. Arthur closed his briefcase slowly. The legal process will take a little time, he said, but the clause is very clear. Margaret nodded. Thank you, Arthur. After he left, only Margaret and Ethan remained in the quiet house. Ethan helped gather the dishes and carry them to the kitchen. You handled that better than anyone I know, he said. Margaret smiled faintly. It took me many years to learn how. Ethan leaned against the counter. Are you all right? Margaret looked around the kitchen, the same room where she and Daniel had shared thousands of quiet conversations over the decades. Yes, she said softly. I actually feel lighter than I have in years. 1 year later, the front windows of Oak Street Coffee House glowed warmly against the cool evening air. The small cafe sat on the corner of a quiet downtown street, its wooden sign swinging gently above the entrance. Inside, soft jazz music played while customers read books, worked on laptops, or talked quietly over steaming cups of coffee. Behind the counter, Ethan moved confidently between the espresso machine and the register. Business had grown steadily since opening. Across the room, a small reading corner had become one of the cafe's most popular spaces. A shelf of donated books lined the wall, and comfortable chairs invited visitors to sit and stay. Margaret Lawson sat in one of those chairs, flipping through the pages of a newly published novel. A framed painting hung nearby, a colorful landscape she had created during one of her art classes. When the bell above the door rang, Margaret looked up. Olivia stepped inside carrying a stroller. Grandma, she said with a smile. Margaret stood to greet her. And who is this? Olivia lifted the blanket covering the stroller slightly. Ava, she said proudly. Your great-granddaughter. Margaret bent down, smiling at the tiny sleeping baby. Well, hello there. Ethan walked over from behind the counter. Perfect timing, he said. I just made a fresh batch of pastries. They all sat together at a nearby table. The cafe buzzed softly around them. Over the past year, many things had changed. Peter and Linda had eventually moved to another state after failing to contest the legal clause in court. Communication between them and Margaret had become limited to occasional holiday messages. Olivia, however, had made a genuine effort to rebuild her relationship with her grandmother. She visited regularly and often helped organize community events at the cafe. Margaret had also changed. She continued her painting classes, traveled with friends several times that year, and even began teaching a weekly art workshop for children at the local community center. For the first time in decades, she felt completely independent. Ethan leaned forward at the table. I've been thinking about expanding the cafe next year, he said. Maybe adding a small bookstore section. Margaret smiled. I think that sounds wonderful. Olivia laughed softly. Grandma is the best investor you could ask for. Margaret raised her teacup. I prefer to think of it as supporting good ideas. The baby in the stroller stirred and let out a tiny sound. Margaret looked down at her great-granddaughter. Life had not unfolded exactly the way she once imagined. But sitting there in the warm cafe surrounded by people who genuinely respected her, she realized something important. A legacy wasn't just about money. It was about the values people chose to carry forward. And this time, Margaret Lawson knew those values were finally in the right hands.